This is a conversation with Anschel Pfeffer, a veteran journalist and the correspondent for The Economist based in Israel. And in this conversation, we talk about two things. About Israel's changing foreign policy, how has it fundamentally changed since the October 7th, whether Israel will attack Iran, why is the Israeli military starting to be dangerously overstretched, or why the Trump-Netenyahu bromance is already over. But before we get to that, we dive quite deep into what's increasingly shaping Israel's foreign policy, which is its domestic political crisis, growing societal polarization, and what Anshel calls an existential crisis that the country is facing. It's a fascinating discussion, and I think that Anshel is really insightful, but also as objective as possible, which I think, especially on this issue, is really important. If you want to get more analysis and insights on geopolitics, I do recommend that you go and subscribe to my free geopolitical newsletter, where I do both deep dives and shorter explainers on what really matters in geopolitics. It's free, and you can find the link in the description. And the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So this podcast is about geopolitics, and so I mostly want to talk about Israeli foreign policy and security and defense. But I think in this case, before we talk about the foreign policy, I think we do need to talk about the Israeli domestic politics, because it seems to shape the foreign policy quite a lot. And specifically, I think, especially for people who don't have a very deep understanding of what's going on, I'd like to talk about the Israeli political crisis that's basically been gripping the country since even before the war. Then it seems to have went away for some time, but now it seems to be back and to be actually getting even worse than before. So could we maybe talk about that, about the Israeli political crisis and the political polarization, and why does it seem to be, what are the sort of roots and causes, and why does it seem to be now getting worse?
Well, I think Israel's been gripped in a political and constitutional crisis since the 4th of January 2023, when the government, which was then in power for a week, I think maybe 6 days, the Justice Minister, Yair Levin, unveiled what he called the judicial reform, legal reform, which was basically a series of laws which, if they were passed, would dramatically weaken the independence and the powers of the Supreme Court. And that proposal unleashed a wave of protests against the new government. And we're talking here about probably the most radical government in Israeli history. It's Likud in its most far-right iteration under Netanyahu, who's obviously very much a veteran prime minister, but Netanyahu, after a period in which he was both out of power and in court for his own corruption trial, so that pushed, I think, has pushed Likud very, very much to the right. Also, the makeup of Likud has become much more religious and radical than it was in the past. Likud used to call itself a national liberal party. I think the liberal side is almost, has all but disappeared, if there is anything left of it. And then you have the far right parties and the ultra orthodox parties. So altogether, this is very much a government in a you could call it fundamentalism. Some would call it fascist. Certainly very illiberal, and determined to make these changes to the Israeli political and constitutional system. So these laws, when they were proposed by Levin then back in January 2023, unleashed this massive waves of protest. It's not just protests in the streets. It's so many of Israel's business community, legal community, the security establishment, in the sense that obviously people who are currently in security roles in the army or in the security services can't take part in protests, but suddenly almost all the former chiefs of and senior officers in security services in the military were against this, and this created, I think, a groundswell of opposition and of protest against the government that we haven't seen. We've never seen in Israel, I think, in 77 years of Israel's existence. And the level of the pushback was something that I think surprised the government. The government thought, oh, we've just been elected, we can do whatever we want. The fact that there was this level of mobilization, and not just of the center left, but also parts of the right wing, which at least people who see themselves as being right wing, but didn't feel part of this very radical coalition. So a very broad swathe of Israeli society and Israeli politics were against this. So the business community, the tech community, which was never really political in the past, all these came together to protest against this, and I think, probably stymied. It stopped the government in its tracks. Most of the legislation was put on hold. Small bit of it did pass after 6 months, but this crisis is an ongoing crisis. That at the beginning of the war in October, the government did suspend legislation for a period. Has been gripping Israel, and it's not just about these legal issues. It's this is like I said, the most radical coalition ever, representing arguably half of Israel. We see now in the polls much less than half, against the other half or more than half of Israel, who feel that their interests and the national interests, as far as they see them, aren't being represented by this coalition. Add to that the polarizing effect of Netanyahu holding on to power for so long, despite being indicted in court for corruption, despite so many people in the country wanting him. And every survey now shows 60-70% of Israelis want Netanyahu to leave. And it shouldn't be about one person, obviously, but it is, and he's made it in that way, and some of his supporters have made it all about him. So yes, Israel is extremely polarized. It's very hard to see any type of unity in Israeli politics around anything, basically. The war is the one thing that most Israelis supported for a while, but they did it without supporting the government. And it's an interesting, I think, phenomena of political science that we know countries that are facing war or facing severe national emergencies have something called the rallying around the flag effect, where people are very patriotic in the support of their country. And if it's a war, at least in the beginning of the war, there's usually a big support for the war and the war effort, the war aims. And usually in other countries, in other cases, this has been also, the rallying around the flag has also been rallying around the national leadership. And we haven't seen that here in Israel. From the very first surveys carried out after the war began on October 7, it was clear that the public believed, yes, we have to fight this war against Hamas in Gaza. And at the same time, that did not translate at any point into support for Netanyahu and for his government. It was very clear from the beginning. I mean, this was already happening before the war, that the protests, I think they had an effect which eroded the support of the government. And at the same time, and when the war began, there wasn't a return of support for the government. If anything, it only entrenched and invigorated the opposition. I mean, not the formal opposition, because the formal opposition did a very bad job, and there's split between many parties. But this general feeling of 60+%, around 2/3 of the Israeli society, who simply don't trust the government, don't think the government is doing things in Israel's national interests, while Israel is at war, which is a very, I don't think that's a natural state of affairs, but it has been a state of affairs in Israel for the last 18 months. So domestically, it's basically Netanyahu and the people who are vested interest in his government, the coalition, and the relatively small communities who are represented by this government, the religious communities, the settlers communities, more or less, and that's it. but they don't constitute much more than maybe a quarter of Israeli society. The rest of Israel is not trusting the government. We've seen throughout the war periods in which the heads of the Israeli army, of the IDF, and of the Shin Bet, the security services, have been in open, having open differences of opinion, major differences of opinion about strategy with Netanyahu and the rest of the government. There's really a very strange, very damaging state of affairs where Israel is still fighting a war. Now it's mainly in Gaza. At different points they were fighting also against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and obviously there were missile attacks from Iran. So Israel has been fighting a war at some points on all fronts over the last year and a half with its society, with its non-political establishment, the security establishment, the business community, and other important parts of Israeli society having very, very open, very bitter differences with the government.
Is the rallying around the flag effect not around the government and the leadership, but more so around the flag in terms of the country and the sense that everyone believes that the war needs to be fought? Is that effect still there, or has that gone away as well?
Well, certainly it was there for the first 6 months or 8 months of the war. What has changed is that, so this war has official aims. Now, these aims are not very tangible, but the aims are basically destroying Hamas's military powers that enabled it to launch the attack on Israel on October 7, destroying its capability to govern Gaza and to return the Israeli hostages who were snatched on October 7. There's still up 59 of them. We're now over a year and a half, and they've been in Gaza for all this time. Over half of them are presumed dead, but there still is at least 20 odd who are alive, and that was also made an official war aim. The problem with trying to release hostages is that if that's not the same as fighting a conventional war or semi-conventional war against, because obviously Hamas is both a military and a guerrilla force, so it's not exactly a conventional war, but fighting a war in which you're seeking to greatly diminish, if not destroy, the entity you're fighting at, while trying to save hostages who are being held by that organization, both from a military, from a strategic standpoint, these are things which are very difficult to do at the same time. With this number of hostages, it's obvious that the only way that they can all be released, or as many as possible, released alive, it won't be through special operations. And even if it was, carrying out special operations and carrying out all-out war are two very different types of military actions. So both on the military level and the strategic level, it's very hard to get both of these, to achieve both of these objectives. And we've seen this throughout the war that almost all the hostages who were released in the two periods of ceasefires that we've had, and the war periods, hostages were killed and died during that period. So what has changed in Israel? And the reason I'm talking about the contradiction or the discrepancy between these different aims of destroying Hamas and saving hostages is that what has changed in Israeli public opinion in the last year or so, perhaps a bit less than a year, but but at some point, kind of halfway in the last year and a half, we saw a shift in Israeli public in the way they see the war and in their priorities. And gradually, a majority of Israelis have said, well, we don't like Hamas. We would love to destroy Hamas, but it's more important for us to secure the lives of the hostages for them to be released. And if the price of that is that the war with Hamas will have to be suspended for forever, how long that may be, we now see that 60% of Israelis in most surveys are saying that is something that they're prepared for, not gladly. They would, I think, nearly all Israelis want to see Hamas destroyed, but if the price of liberating the hostages and seeing them return alive is a ceasefire which ends this war indefinitely, then most Israelis are now prepared, I think, for that. And this is not the government's policy. The government's policy is that they're only prepared to do temporary ceasefires, but not something which will be lasting. And obviously Hamas, who captured the hostages and have been holding them for a year and a half in Gaza, their position at this point is that they only have a limited number of hostages that they still hold. They want to hold them as bargaining chips in the hope of extracting from Israel a deal which will allow them to remain in power in Gaza and end the war.
What's the thinking from the government of pursuing a policy that seems to be now increasingly unpopular if I guess their main goal is to remain in power? Wouldn't it make more sense to, if 60% disagree with this policy, to switch and try to go with what the majority of the society wants?
So I think the government is in a bit of a bubble of its own, in the sense that most of the ministers, the members of the government, when they go back home, when they go to the places where they live and in their own sort of communities, they do meet most of the people they meet are people who agree with the government. It's not like the government's policy has no backing. Around a third of Israelis do back the government's policy. So I think on that level, they are being reinforced. I think that they hope that, and certainly Netanyahu hopes that in the time between now and when the election is held, and we don't know for sure when that's going to be, but by October next year, so in a year and a half, more or less, there has to be an election, that things can happen things that will happen until then. Netanyahu thought that would be the case after Israel, I think, quite successfully fought Hamas. It's not Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon. He thought that would be enough of a popularity boost. It was a bit of a boost, but not enough to change the picture. And I think the gains that he made then in public opinion towards the end of last year, I think that's been eroded from what we're seeing now in the polls. But Netanyahu thinks that some things will happen to change the situation in with the public opinion. I think he also is relying on his own success in running very efficient election campaigns, where he has managed to maximize his base while the opposition has been very divided, very inefficient. And that kind of thing gives you an advantage, even if in the raw data of public opinion, there's a majority of Israelis who don't want you to be prime minister, don't want your government to be re-elected. It's still not the same thing as actually replacing the government, because that you need an alternative leadership. You need the opposition, who may have on paper more support than the government. They need to be more efficient. And right now, Israel's opposition parties are in no way as united as the coalition. I mean, basically, what works for Netanyahu is that his coalition is still pretty united around him, and in their hatred of what they call the left. There's no such thing as left in Israel. In Israel, it's basically sort of radical extremists against centrists. There's no left wing in any real term here, but they call it the left, and for them, the left is terrible, and anything is better than letting the left together, letting the left back into power, and that's keeping the coalition together, and it'll keep them together, I think, is quite likely to keep them together in the next election campaign, which is worth, arguably 10% of the vote. If you can, Israel's a parliamentary system, so it's different, and it's not It's not first past the post like in Britain. So every government in Israel has been a coalition government. You always need a few parties to band together to win a majority in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. So for that, the way that they can work together gives them an advantage, and I think Netanyahu is still banking on that. I think he's banking on the fact that in a year and a half, if the election is only held next October, that some of the anger towards him for everything that's gone wrong in the last year and a half, and even before that, and the way that they pursued their constitutional change, that some of the anger will have dissipated by then, and that maybe he'll have succeeded in dividing the opposition. He already has actually managed to entice one small opposition party into the coalition. So we've actually seen the coalition grow, not by anything major, but a few Knesset seats have been added to the coalition's bloc. It's a party which, according to all the surveys, has no support anymore. But the fact that they do have seats from the last election has actually enhanced and enlarged Netanyahu's political bloc. So he's banking on the fact that on the hope and on the previous experience that he can play the Israeli system better than anyone else. So even if in reality a majority of Israelis are against him, he thinks he can still somehow survive an election. And meanwhile, he's just pushing, he's playing for time until the election is held.
I'd like to maybe understand a little bit better the polarization that you've already sort of mentioned of the Israeli society, because I guess one part of it is about Netanyahu, the other part is about whether the war in Gaza should continue or not. But those are, I guess, in this current form will go away at some point, so they are more temporary. But in the description of your upcoming book, you talk about Israel facing cataclysmic rifts. So it sounds more like that the two halves of the Israeli society just have very different visions for what the country should be. So what are these rifts, and what are the structural or systemic reasons for this polarization?
Well, first of all, it's not two halves; it's much more than that. But I think there are a number of issues that are dividing Israelis and right now dividing them in very fundamental ways. It's a lot of it is around religion, and not when I say religion, I don't necessarily mean Jews and Muslims. Yes, obviously, there's 20% of Israelis who are Palestinian origin and Muslims and so on. So that they have their own agenda and interests. But I mean, amongst the majority Jewish society in Israel, the way in which religion, the role religion plays in their lives, the way that they understand their Israeli and their Jewish identity based on different religious approaches, that is, and obviously this also is partly due to the societal issues, but really religion is the main thing here, where there is a group of people who we call ultra-Orthodox, whose their view of their own Jewish identity and the place they have in Israeli society is that they should be allowed to be in an isolated place without contributing in intangible ways to the economy, and without having their young men and women being conscripted into the army. I'm sure you and your listeners know that almost all Israelis join the army. There's national conscription here. So we have this part of Israeli society, which is about 13 or 14%, which on the one hand, they take part in the political game. They're part of the coalition. They have parties and there are ministers and so on. But they insist that the way that they contribute to Israeli society is by studying ancient Jewish texts, and they're having their men sit in religious seminaries for many, many years, in some cases entire lifetimes, but certainly not in their 20s go and join up in the army or be part or get a college or any kind of professional education and be part of what is an Israeli, is a very advanced Israeli economy. I'm sure your listeners also know that Israel's economy is based to a large degree on its tech exports. So that's kind of one. Some people call them the tribe. I'm not really a fan of that term. But that is one part of Israel's Jewish society. Then you have another part. The settlers themselves are probably only about 4 or 5% of Israel, but the religious part of the settler community, so as people actually live on West Bank settlements and also, excuse me, and also Israelis who live within the recognized borders of Israel but are supportive of those settlements. That's another probably similar sort of proportion of around 10, maybe 12% of Israelis. So they are religious, but if their religiosity doesn't prevent them from being part of Israeli society, but their aspirations, which are very much determined by their religious beliefs, is for a sort of a greater land of Israel philosophy, which includes the settlements, which means that they would be in favor of annexing the West Bank and at some point also of Gaza and building settlements there. And if the Palestinians have any problems with that, then they can just then they would have to leave. So you've got together this sort of 25% of Israelis, the ultra-Orthodox and the religious settler community, which I say is not just settlers, but supported by the settlers, who constitute this around a quarter of Israel. So you've got these two tribes, and they don't have the same aspirations, but they've been working together because they are both Orthodox, they're both religious, and they're both in Netanyahu's coalition. Now there's some friction between them over the fact that the ultra-Orthodox, excuse me, don't send their kids to the army. So that now become a source of friction. But generally, they do work together. They have similar values in most subjects. And this is the bedrock of Netanyahu's coalition. Netanyahu himself is not a religious man. He's pretty, I don't think he believes in God, and he doesn't really live according to the Orthodox Jewish law, and that's something that he tries to hide, but he kind of tries to not make a big deal out of it, and he uses all kinds of catchphrases that the religious like to hear from him. And he has always been almost always been able to rely on the support of these two communities and of the parties that represent them in the Knesset. So he has had to basically align Likud, and Likud, like I said, was originally and not a religious and quite liberal, even though it was very nationalistic, but it had a lot of liberal values to it as well. He has gradually aligned Likud with those parts. So that's another sort of part of society. They're kind of sort of not very religious people who support Likud, or another, I don't know, maybe 15% of Israelis. So you've got here sort of these groups which together now consist of about 40%. And then you've got about 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish. And now you've got roughly 40% of Israelis who don't accept the values of the religions of the far right, but they're just 40%, and they're kind of strung across a wider range of values. So, this is the 40% where most of the tech community comes from. And Israel, famously, Israel has the highest percentage of any country in the world of people who are employed in tech. So in tech and the broader STEM sectors, and that's around Israel. That's now about 10.5%. And if you ever look at the OECD charts, and your next countries is the US and Switzerland, who are 6 or 7%. So Israel's leading by a quite a significant margin in having the highest proportion of people in the workforce in tech. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that 10% comes to a very disproportionate level from 40% of Israeli society. So that creates a situation where you have a tech economy and you have a sort of a tech society, but it only represents maybe at most half of Israelis. So you've got these kind of you've got a very advanced Israeli economy making a lot of money by exporting technology and wares outside of Israel. And then you've got another part of the country which aren't even part of this economy. And not necessarily because they're being kept out, but because they're not teaching their kids and the kind of skills that they would need to be here. They're not seeking to join. There are societal barriers and so on. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why for the tech community has joined the opposition in a very strong way over the last 2.5 years, which we never ever saw before in Israel, that the tech community taking sides in political divides. You know, they're always like, we want to make money and to do business with the world. And now, since this government was formed in such a blatant way, with these parts of society who are not part of the high yield tech economy and society, and with people who refuse to teach their children, the core general subject of the curriculum, and people who won't join the armed forces. This has kind of created a feeling that amongst the Israelis who are not in the government, who are supportive of the opposition, of their country being stolen away from them, not just because they are not currently in government, but because they're the one paying most of the taxes, and they're the ones whose children at the highest rate serve in the armed forces and in security services. They're the ones who see much more of a value and an importance in having an independent judiciary. They're the ones who don't want their money to go and necessarily sponsor religious seminaries and other and settlements and so on. So this is created. I mean, these divides have existed in Israel for decades now, arguably since Israel captured from Jordan the West Bank in 1967, and settlements began to be built shortly after that. But it's never been as deep as it is now, in the sense that I think a large number of Israelis do not feel any real kinship or relationship with the other side, with the other political tribes, to a degree which I do not remember. I think even back in 1995, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated because of his support for the Oslo process with the Palestinians, even then it was much easier to see that as an action coming from a very tiny group of extremists rather than entire Israeli communities. And I think now the feeling is that Israeli communities has very little kind of keeping them together and see each other. And obviously there's a lot of people in the middle who are trying to say, no, we can get along. And they do get along. You know, they serve together in the army, and they're together in various other ways. But the political enmity, I think, is at levels that we've never had before in Israel.
Well, I do want to talk more about the foreign policy and the geopolitical stuff. But before that, I think maybe one more question. What do you think all of this is heading towards? Because I feel like many countries are polarized, but it seems that in Israel, it is on a more fundamental level and also about quite practical issues. And it seems that the polarization and the existential crisis is becoming more pronounced rather than less. So it seems to be intensifying. And listening to you, it kind of feels like Israel is spending a lot of energy on protecting or preparing for threats that are coming from the outside, but the internal division in any country, when it reaches a certain point, can be maybe even a bigger threat than the ones coming externally. So what do you think all of this is heading towards in the future? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.